أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين وبعد. This is the second lecture on Theodicy. We are using Eric Ormsby's study as the basis of these lectures, namely his Theodicy in Islamic Thought, the dispute over Al-Ghazali's Best of All Possible Worlds, Princeton University Press, 1984. Last time we covered the material the material from the introduction. And today we would like to jump right into the problem. As found, not as formulated, but I will say as found in Al-Ghazali's writing. So we're going to cover about 30 pages or so. I do like to try and stay close to the book. That's especially important in an online sort of course like this where you have no idea, you're just putting it out there and seeing who tunes in. So we'll be covering about the first 30 pages of this chapter. Yeah, okay. And so that runs from page 32 until page 60. We're going to cover that material. This chapter is entitled The Perfect Rightness of the Actual. And the entire controversy revolves around a statement which is found in Al-Ghazali's book known as Ihya Ulumuddin, which means the revival or the revivification of the sciences of religion, or more elegantly, the religious sciences. It's a large book. It represents the mature thought of Al-Ghazali. It's traditionally it has been published in 4 volumes, different editions, because those volumes follow the actual divisions of the book. However, in recent years, various other newer editions, presumably critical editions, have been issued in the Arabic language, and you can find find a lot of these online. There's a 10-volume edition. There's other volumes. At any rate, this represents the mature thought of Al-Ghazali, and this is after his adoption of Sufism. And indeed, the entire discussion takes a sort of Sufi turn Now, the phrase in question is "Laysa fil imkan abda' mimma kan." Al-Ghazali does not actually use those exact words in Arabic, and in the translation of Eric Ormsby, he renders that as "there is not in possibility anything more wonderful than what is." We'll see exactly how Al-Ghazali phrased it. It's more or less the same, but people tended to phrase it this way afterwards because it was an elegant kind of almost aphoristic expression of what Al-Ghazali is trying to say in what is actually a very long passage. So there is a certain amount of tension also, I think, in Al-Ghazali's work. This will come out in the course of today's lecture. And that tension is because he seems to contradict himself in other works. In other words, he seems to take the position that, well, actually, things could be better than they are. Because the formulation, laysa fil imkan abda' mimma kan, is taken to mean that there is nothing but the perfect rightness of the actual, as this chapter is entitled. That the way things are in the cosmos are the best that they could be. And that this universe or this cosmos is the best of all possible universes or cosmoses or worlds. And Al-Ghazali seems actually to have espoused different position elsewhere, which led some people, and this is actually at the end of the chapter, but I'm just putting it here at the front, at the very beginning of our discussion. So at the end of the chapter, Ormsby discusses the idea that, perhaps this statement can't really be ascribed to Al-Ghazali. That really doesn't work, because there is a very long passage, and we're going to look at that passage today. It stretches over about maybe 2 pages, depending on which edition you use, but Ormsby breaks it down into lines, which he's numbered. So it's about 100 lines. So that can easily fit on a couple of pages. And so you can't say that entire passage and of 100 lines, it's sort of, there's a whole context there. And so then how do you explain that? Well, I think that Al-Ghazali just wasn't a consistent thinker. That's what I think. I don't think that he's writing philosophy. He actually did change his mind about things in his life. But I do think that he did uphold this doctrine simply because he has another work in which he comments on portions of the Ihya, and in which, in fact, he defends certain positions that he's taken, and he defends that position. So maybe in other writings he had held other positions. A lot of people forget that, Al-Ghazali was extremely prolific over a long period of time, and he may have changed his mind. There are works and studies that have been done that look at the chronology of the writings of Al-Ghazali. I don't have those handy at the moment. I have them somewhere, but I didn't consult them for this lecture. Suffice it to say that it's my opinion that Al-Ghazali was not necessarily consistent in all of his writings, and again, those were done over a long period of time. So the statement, let's just jump right into it. لَيْسَ فِي الْإِمْكَانِ أَبْدَعْ مِمَّا كَانَ. The key word there is abda, which he renders here wonderful. He meaning Eric Ormsby, renders it by wonderful. And it's in the comparative form, the af'al, which can also be the superlative form. So this is a superlative degree, that there is nothing more wonderful than what is. In Arabic, it would be abda. And the word the root from which that word derives, if you consult your standard Hansver dictionary, the root is bada'a yabda'u, and it really means to introduce, create, originate. You'll find the same meanings more or less in the Arabic lexicons, the Arabic lexicons. So it says here to create, to achieve unique, excellent results, to be amazing. And that's sort of the idea that's at work here. In Arabic, you might say, حدثت شيئا بديعا, or جئت بشيء بديع. You made something, you did something really amazing. It also has a literary context of a kind of poetic originality and beauty. It's also used in those contexts. So the idea here is that it's not just that this is the best of all possible worlds, but in Arabic it's saying that this is the most wonderful of all possible worlds. So it gives it a slightly different nuance than if you just say it's the best of all possible worlds. There are a lot of things going on in this statement, and the reason that it led to a controversy is because there were plenty of people who objected to it. And the objections really arise out of certain classic central issues in Islamic theology. You have to keep in mind, I think we mentioned in the previous lecture, that the theological school or tendency which became dominant in the Sunni world was the Ash'ari school, and Al-Ghazali did subscribe to that. But the Ash'aris originally kind of gave a supreme kind of status. One might even say they absolutized the divine will, giving it this great importance. That is to say that, well, God can do whatever he wants. Allah can do whatever he wills. And if he wanted to make a world better than this, he certainly could. And gosh, isn't this such a terrible world? The reason that this argument appeals to people is because there are plenty of people who think that, well, it would be a lot better if it didn't rain, if it hadn't rained today, or if there hadn't been that tsunami, or the whole universe, maybe they wouldn't go so far as to say the whole universe is out of kilter, but they would say, gosh, my life would have been so much better if I would have gotten into my dream college, or things of this kind. Again, it's this whole question of the problem of evil and of suffering, which we talked about before. So the idea is that if you say that this is the most wonderful of all possible universes, that there couldn't be a more wonderful cosmos than what we have, then it would seem on the Ash'ari view that there is a kind of, as Ormsby puts it, restriction of the divine omnipotence, or hasrul qudra, in the view of those people who criticize this idea. He says, and there are a lot of elegant turns of phrases in Ormsby's book. He says on page 33, this is in fact the crux of the problem. For if nothing in possibility is quote-unquote more wonderful or more perfect than what actually exists here and now, then God's omnipotence seems severely compromised. Is the mic okay now?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay.
Just
so
when I ask questions, I want to...
Indeed. So this is part of the problem. There's more to the problem also. There's more to objections to this formulation. And it would seem that Al-Ghazali, although he's really, in my view, no philosopher, people thought he was a philosopher, especially in medieval Europe, because of a summary of philosophical doctrines, which he actually wrote, only to write another work refuting them later, but that work was rendered into Latin, and it was called Maqasid al-Falasifa. And so people thought that Al-Ghazali, or Al-Ghazal in Latin is how he was known, was some kind of a philosopher. Al-Ghazali was not a philosopher. And I honestly think that in Tahafut al-Falasifa, he didn't understand certain views of the philosophers, or maybe he did, and maybe he in some sense misrepresented them, because when he refutes them, he constructs what we call constructing a straw man. He presents the argument in a certain way and then attacks it. But let's not get off the topic. But the point which I'm trying to make is that this notion of laysa fil imkan abda' mimma kan, there is nothing impossibility, or there is not in possibility anything more wonderful than what is dangerously close to the teaching of the philosophers, or some of the philosophers, that Allah creates the universe or makes the universe not out of some kind of free choice, but out of a kind of necessity intrinsic to his nature, which is known as al-ijab with dhati. And finally, what we may call the laysa fil imkan doctrine, that there is nothing more wonderful doctrine, is also dangerously similar or close in resemblance to the Mu'tazili notion of the optimum, or al-aslah. And so this is why many people objected excuse me, to this teaching of Al-Ghazali. But what does it actually say? Let's actually look at the passage in question. The passage in question is translated by Eric Ormsby on pages 38, from near the bottom of page 38, about 2/3 down page 238, all the way up to about a third of the page 41. And he conveniently numbers the lines of his translation. It's about 100 lines, and the numbers are every 5, 10, 15, and so forth in the right hand margin. Now, if you actually want to see the Arabic, I'm not going to read out the Arabic. It's just too long. But I have it here. There are various editions. I don't have the publication data on this one. I just didn't print that page. I have it on my laptop. I don't want to waste any time on it. What I'll do is that for those people who actually know Arabic and who are interested in reading this passage, I will upload these 2 pages, which I have printed out with the publication data, and I've marked the passage very clearly. I'll put them on a Google Drive, and anyone who's interested can download and read the whole Arabic. Okay? There is also a very important context before we read this, and we will cover maybe about half of this today. So I will actually read out, because we have to sort of situate ourselves, the first 40 or 50 lines of this, and then we will discuss it. But I want to point out the context in which Al-Ghazali is writing. As I said, Al-Ghazali is no really systematic philosopher. He engaged with philosophy. He argued against philosophical positions of people like Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi, but he himself is not a philosopher, and he certainly is not a philosopher or writing as one.
So what is he then? Is he just an author, or
he's a Sufi? He's writing as a Sufi in this passage, which is in the Ihya. He is committed to Sufism, and we are very fortunate that Al-Ghazali wrote an autobiography before he died, near the end of his life, which is translated into English. It's available. The autobiography is entitled, in Arabic, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, or Deliverance from Error. It's a short book. It's very readable. And in fact, it's on the basis of that autobiographical statement that Abdul Latif Salazar, or Ovidio Salazar, as his name appears on the CD, at the time it was a CD, he made a movie, a documentary about Al-Ghazali, with dramatization, called The Alchemist of Happiness. And there's all these supposed experts who come on as well, who make remarks and so forth. Among them, the people who get the most exposure in that, there were others, but the ones they give a lot of exposure to are Hamza Yusuf Hansen,
of course,
and T.J. Winter, aka Abdul Hakim Winter. And it's not so much that what they say there isn't correct. It's just that, they take a certain view of Al-Ghazali, and they don't really go into the whole historical circumstances. But I don't want to go into all of that now. Let's stay on topic. So,
did we reference the Cambridge edition of the Problem of Evil in the last video?
I think we did.
Because T.J. Winter has an essay in that one.
Yeah, I think we did. I think in the last, since you've brought it up, we mentioned that this is an interesting work of reference called The Cambridge Companion to the Problem of Evil, in which T.J. Winter has an entry on the problem of evil in Islam. Sorry, Islam and the problem of evil. Okay. A minor difference. I don't really think it's a very profound treatment, but anyhow. So Al-Ghazali, he undergoes this crisis, he leaves Baghdad, etc. And he comes back, it's like 10 years later, and he writes the Kitab Ihya Ulumuddin. So in his autobiography, he looks at the different ways and different disciplines and different ways of attaining to knowledge that were popular in his time. And one of these is Sufism, and he basically comes out in favor of Sufism, saying that Sufism really is the way to ultimate truth. So in this passage from the Ihya, and it's in volume 4, it's in the last fourth from the traditional division of the Kitab al-Ihya, and in most of the older editions, it'll always be in volume 4. It's in the section on the divine unity and utter reliance on Allah, what's called at-tawakkul. So he is discussing the maqam, or the spiritual rank or station, of complete and total reliance on God, utter dependence and manifestation of complete and total reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all things, as a spiritual station, as a maqam. And it's in that context that he talks about the cosmos and the universe and the things that are going on in the universe, and how the state of affairs which obtains there is the most wonderful that it could be. So he actually says, and there is not in possibility anything whatever more excellent, more perfect, and more complete than it. The statement in Arabic is وَلَيْسَ فِي الْإِمْكَانِ أَصْلًا أَحْسَنُ مِنْهُ وَلَا أَتَمَّ وَلَا أَكْمَلُ. So you have to keep in mind, the takeaway from this is that he's not in this page and a half or so presenting a philosophical or metaphysical argument. He is talking about a particular spiritual disposition, a maqam, which the Sufi aspirant is to try to attain to. And it might interest you to know that there is a huge commentary on the Ihya. Ihya Ulumuddin is already a large book, and there's even a larger commentary on it by a very prolific writer named Murtada Az-Zabidi. Murtada Az-Zabidi died in 1205 of the Hijrah, 1791. A lot of people forget this, but he was actually born in India. He was Indian in origin, from Bilgram. And he wrote this massive commentary on the Ihya, which is called Ittihaf As-Sadat Al-Muttaqin بشرح أسرار إحياء علوم الدين, 10 volumes, Cairo, 1311, 1894. Old book. And he's also the author of the largest dictionary in the Arabic language, Taj al-Urus min Jawahir al-Qamus, which formed the basis for Edward William Lane's lexicon. So Murtada Zabidi is quoted here in translation by Ormsby on page 38 before he actually introduces the passage from the Ihya, saying that, and I quote, ellipsis, in other words, ... his purpose, named the Al-Ghazali's purpose, in this passage, is to incite man to the utmost in reliance on God, tawakkul in Arabic. That is what this question is all about, and to contentment with every decree of God, so that man may not despair over an evil which befalls him or a good which eludes him. So Murtada Az-Zabidi, who's well aware of the controversy that ensued from the time that this work was written up, even until his time, that the original context of this was a discussion of this utmost reliance on God and how to cultivate that. So without further ado, let us read what Al-Ghazali says.
It's a pretty stoic way of looking at it.
It's a very stoic way. Yeah, he kind of jumps in because in Arabic it says وَهُوَ أَن يُصَدِّقَ تَصْدِيقًا. So the وَهُوَ is referring back to a previous thing. And to make an elegant transition, we'll start by reading the paragraph as Ormsby words it to introduce it. So the beginning part is Ormsby. In his discussion of the realization of the divine unity, Tawheed, which is the basis, asl, of trust in God, Al-Ghazali states that to reach this stage of trust, it is necessary that, now here we have a colon, and now the quotation begins. It is necessary that one believe with utter certainty, in which there is neither weakness nor doubt, that if God had created all creatures with the intelligence of the most intelligent among them, and the knowledge of the most learned among them, and if he had created for them all the knowledge their souls could sustain, and had poured out upon them wisdom of indescribable extent, then had he given each one of them the knowledge, wisdom, and intelligence of them all, and revealed to them the consequences of things, and taught them the mysteries of the transcendent world, and acquainted them with the subtleties of divine favor and the mysteries of final punishments, until they were made well aware of good and evil, benefit and harm, then, if he had ordered them to arrange this world and the transcendent world in terms of the knowledge and wisdom they had received, even then, that act of arrangement on the part of all of them, helping each other and working in concert, would not make it necessary to add to the way in which God has arranged creation in this world and the next by so much as a gnat's wing, in other words, the most trifling thing, nor to subtract from it by so much as a gnat's wing, nor would it raise a speck of dust or lower a speck of dust. Their arrangement would not ward off sickness or fault or defect or poverty or injury from one so afflicted, and it would not remove health or perfection or wealth or advantage from one so favored. The last few lines in the Arabic, if you read it in Arabic, you have to do it a few times because the verbs in this paragraph, sometimes they're passive and sometimes they're active, and you have to think, well, who is the fa'il and who is not, and so you have to read it carefully. And I think he's done a good job of dealing with that. And the passage continues for about 15-20 more lines. But if people directed their gaze and considered steadfastly everything that God has created in heaven and earth, they would see neither discrepancy nor rift. Everything which God apportions to man, such as sustenance, lifespan, pleasure and pain, capacity and incapacity, belief and disbelief, obedience and sin, is all of it sheer justice, with no injustice in it, and pure right with no wrong in it. Here I would make the observation that the Islamic understanding of justice, the Arabic term adl, literally means everything being in its proper place. Let's conclude the passage. Indeed, it is according to the necessarily right order, in accord with what must be, and as it must be, and in the measure in which it must be. Now, here's the controversial statement. And there is not in possibility anything whatever more excellent, more perfect, and more complete than it. وَلَيْسَ فِي الْإِمْكَانِ أَصْلًا أَحْسَنُ مِنْهُ وَلَا أَتَمُّ وَلَا أَكْمَلُ. And that's the phrase which was elegantly condensed down to reformulated into لَيْسَ فِي الْإِمْكَانِ أَبْدَعْ مِمَّا كَانَ. There is not in possibility anything more wonderful than what is. Last paragraph, or last few lines. For if there were, in other words, if there were a universe more wonderful than what is, for if there were, and he had withheld it, having power to create it, but not deigning to do so, this would be miserliness contrary to the divine generosity, and injustice contrary to the divine justice. But if he were not able, it would be incapability contrary to divinity. Indeed, all poverty and loss in this world is a diminution in this world, but an increase in the next. I think we'll stop there. So that's the first 50 lines. And Ormsby then goes on to analyze and discuss this text from the Ihya Ulumuddin. His discussion from time to time introduces remarks made by different people who came after Al-Ghazali and engaged with his work. But he doesn't do that in too much detail. He leaves that for the next chapter. He talks about Al-Ghazali's predecessors or intellectual forebears here, and there are some important ones. But he divides the discussion of the entire 100-line passage, and again, we only read the first 50, into 4 sections. The first he calls the perfect rightness of the actual, which deals with lines 1 through 40 and stretches over pages 41 to 44 of his book. And then he has some subheadings under the perfect rightness of the actual, which we will come to, because that's what we're discussing today. Then he has the second part, the disputed statement. In other words, there's nothing in all of possibility more wonderful than what is. And then the third section is the correlation of, he calls the correlation of the perfect and the imperfect. And then the last part, the fourth part, is the secret of predestination. And that's all set out in his book. In the pages that follow. So under the perfect rightness of the actual, lines 1 to 40, Ormsby discusses the divine wisdom, and he divides this discussion of the divine wisdom also into 2 portions: the natural order, in other words, the divine wisdom as manifested in the natural order, and then the divine wisdom as manifested in the social order. Then he talks about the intrinsic superiority of existence, and finally the hiddenness of the world's perfection, and that's where we'll wrap it up today. So let's just jump right in here. Lines 1 to 40 deal with the perfect rightness of the actual. That also happens to be the overall title of this chapter. Ormsby says on page 41, the world as it is, and not otherwise, the actual state of affairs, is superior to any merely hypothetical alternative order. Now, this idea is pretty counterintuitive, because most people think that, people are always thinking, well, it would be better if things were this way or that way, or if I did this or I did that. And Al-Ghazali is arguing, no, really, if you truly are someone who is on the path of tawakkul, if you really want to be a spiritually realized person, you must be content with whatever happens. All right, so that's not easy to do. He's not the first person to advocate this. This is a very old idea. And in this passage, he is heavily indebted to someone named Abu Talib al-Makki. Abu Talib al-Makki died 386-996 of the Christian calendar, wrote a important book which is very similar to the Ihya, called Yaqutul Qulub, or the food of the hearts, or the sustenance of the hearts. And Al-Ghazali is heavily indebted to this. In fact, some people said he basically has reworked a passage from the Qutul Qulub. And there's another important book. I have it, but we don't need to pull it out and just show it on camera. But it's also a famous book. I also have the Qutul Qulub, but I don't know where my copy is right now. But there's another book another figure he's, I think, heavily indebted to, and that's Abu al-Qasim al-Qushayri. And Abu al-Qasim al-Qushayri is the author of the famous Al-Risalat al-Qushayriyah. Ormsby mentions both of these figures. Abu al-Qasim Abdul Karim al-Qushayri died 465 of the Hijrah, 1072 Common Era. And then he also singles out someone named Abu Harith ibn Asad al-Muhasibi, died 243, 857. So these are important early figures. But in terms of the wording of this passage, it's very similar to what is in the Qutul Qulub. The full bibliographical references and editions are given in the footnotes. We won't spend any time of that. But for both Al-Ghazali and Abu Talib al-Makki, this world is not only right and just as it is insuperably so, writes Ormsby. Even if God were to increase human knowledge and wisdom to the fullest extent imaginable, and grant man unlimited freedom to rearrange the cosmos, even then it could not be improved. Now it seems, and I don't have the passage from Abu Talib al-Makki handy because I can't find my copy of Qutul Qulub, but Ormsby says that Abu Talib al-Makki intensifies this assertion of the world being absolutely perfect, even if man had unlimited freedom to rearrange the cosmos. He intensifies this with a sentence which is omitted in Al-Ghazali's recasting of Abu Talib, and that is, and I quote, translation of Ormsby, top of page 42, even if God were to assist and strengthen man, his attempt to redesign the world order would be unavailing. So the translated part in question is, even if God were to assist and strengthen. So again, this is all in the context of urging and exhorting people to trust in God and cultivate tawakkul. Of course, the whole spiritual problem is that dissatisfaction is part of the human condition. Dissatisfaction with things as they are, as Ormsby phrases it, forms an obstacle to trust in God. And obviously both Al-Ghazali, Abu Talib al-Makki, al-Qushayri, al-Muhasibi, all of them are trying to inculcate and instill this kind of devotion, this kind of complete and total reliance on God. So there's the idea that you have to cultivate tawakkul. You have to cultivate complete and total reliance on God, complete sabr, patience, but even stronger word would be fortitude, perseverance in the face of life, of things. So that is sort of the context in which Al-Ghazali is introducing this, but obviously he goes a lot further. He's not just making a statement about cultivating a certain state of mind, because it's one thing to say that, look, don't get discouraged, face things as they are, but then it's another to say, look, things can't be any better than they are. What does that mean for human agency? These are the kind of questions which come up. And of course, Muslims believe that the universe is not the product of random chance or blind activity. And so the idea behind this is that tawakkul, complete and total reliance and trust in God and on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, presupposes the recognition of the perfect rightness of things, the perfect rightness of the actual. So how do you argue for that? Well, that's what Al-Ghazali is trying to do by introducing this notion of divine wisdom, which is really what's there in the first 40 lines or so. And that this divine wisdom extends or encompasses both the natural as well as the social order. Now, there's some really nice turns of phrase here in Ormsby. So on page 44, he says, a signal characteristic of most attempts at theodicy is the belief that no aspect of the world, however insignificant it may seem, is without some redeeming reason. Now, Al-Ghazali does not formulate such a principle, but Ormsby invokes this principle, which is very much there and very much part of the whole discussion of theodicy in Western philosophy, and that is the principle of sufficient reason. And of course, he quite rightly notes that this PSR, as it's often abbreviated, the PSR goes hand in hand with theodicy. The principle of sufficient reason may be stated as nothing is without a sufficient reason why it is, rather than it is not. And he ascribes this to someone named Christian Wolff, who lived from 1679 to 1754. Originally stated in Latin. And there's a version of it by Schopenhauer in German, which I'm not even going to attempt to read out here. But he goes on to say that in following the principle of sufficient reason, the proponent of theodicy will be compelled to discover the sufficient reason for the existence of such manifestly destructive, noxious, or at best nugatory creatures as bedbugs, flies, lice, etc., as well as such catastrophes as earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, and the like. He says a few words, a brief paragraph about how, this kind of idea, this kind of discussion, in other words, the notion of that, well, look, if everything has a sufficient reason, you've got to explain mosquitoes and flies and so on and so forth. It goes back to the Stoics, this discussion. And of course, in the Al-Ghazali passage, this perfect rightness of the actual, which is also the unalterable rightness, because we can't change it. Not only can we not change it, even if we were able to, we had all this power, we'd still come up with the same universe, that nothing would change the way things are. So the perfect rightness of the actual is also the unalterable rightness of the actual. And this perfect rightness and unalterable rightness of the actual is reflected and evinced in even the most seemingly insignificant things, the most trifling of things, as you say in Arabic, even the wing of a gnat. Janahu ba'udatin, we say in Arabic. That's an image which is actually from the Quran. And so the argument is made, well, that now you've got to find a sufficient reason in all of these things. And so this is very similar to, although it's not being made in this context, but it's very similar to the kind of arguments we find nowadays, especially among many people of religious belief in various religions, when they argue for the existence of the God, so-called design arguments. That, if you examine even the most insignificant of things, that you will find tremendous wisdom in them. You will find design, wisdom. You will find intelligence, intelligent design, even these kind of things. So Al-Ghazali, in other writings elsewhere, the footnotes are all given here. The citations are all in the footnotes. That Al-Ghazali, and others like him, they are trying to they're trying to inspire a sense of amazement in the reader. There's this idea that philosophy goes back to the ancient Greeks, this idea that philosophy ultimately begins in wonder. And so they're trying to, Al-Ghazali is trying very hard to ignite or reignite a kind of amazement and sense of wonder which is there among human beings but may have become dulled to some extent due to familiarity.
Yeah, I mean, that's what was happening to me when I was reading the passages, I think.
So there's this idea that there's a meticulous wisdom, as he says, as Ormsby writes here, revealed in the actual placement of things within creation. I already mentioned this notion of adl as being, in Islam, justice is really, adl, the term adl, or which is often translated as justice, is really everything being in the right place. So this idea of divine wisdom in the natural order is absolutely central to trying to understand Al-Ghazali's Theodicy. At the same time, we've got to realize that this notion of divine wisdom was, to a great extent, repugnant to many of Al-Ghazali's Ash'ari co-madhabis, or co-religionists, if you like, his fellow Ash'arites. Ormsby summarizes it nicely here. He says, so for these Ash'arites, any attempt to rationalize God's actions was suspect. In the dispute, objections will be raised to Al-Ghazali's reliance on the notion of wisdom. In other words, the dispute that extended over centuries. And that is a very, very serious charge against the Ash'ari position. And it seems to me, and Ormsby is of this view as well, that Al-Ghazali is maybe trying to temper somewhat this tendency in the Ash'ari school by espousing such a notion. So Al-Ghazali also speaks about the perfect wisdom in the human body as well. That, this rigorous rightness, if we could say rigorous justice, if we understand the term justice as the Arabic adl, that everything is in its right place. The bones of the hand are in the right place. All the complex biological, physical chemistry, biochemistry of the body is very fine-tuned, and so on and so forth. So I'm not really going to look at all these kind of examples which are introduced here in Ormsby's discussion. He's done quite a good job of actually tracing some of the historical background to this. Al-Ghazali was a very learned man. He was acquainted with the medical theories of his time, and in the Ihya and other writings he displayed his knowledge of the medical and anatomical and physiological knowledge of his day, in arguing for the human body also being a manifestation of this perfect rightness and justice, which is also unalterable and is the most marvelous. This perfect rightness, this unalterable rightness, extends also to the social order. There is complete justice and right in every condition of life. Now, this is where things become very complicated, because it would seem to indicate that human beings don't have any agency, but our experience tells us that we do. We go into a restaurant, we order off of the menu, we make choices all the time. We have volitional acts. But again, you have to look at it from this kind of Sufi point of view. So while the Sufi does recognize some degree of human agency, he is trying to emphasize God as the sole agent. Of course, that doesn't absolve him from responsibility, and God will hold him responsible, from the Shār'i point of view, for whether he does his salat and his fasting, his prayers and his dhikr and everything that he's supposed to do. In that sense, the divine agency extends and covers all things and extends to all facets of human existence. Al-Ghazali, in another passage in the Ihya, is this the Ihya? He says that this is the Ihya, but then he footnotes that this is the Kitab al-Arba'in. Whatever the case may be, on page 53, Al-Ghazali is describing the role of divine will in human life. Al-Ghazali says, in translation, God wills existing things and sets things created in time in order, for there occur in this world and in the transcendent world neither few nor many, small nor great, good nor evil, benefit nor harm, belief nor unbelief, recognition nor denial, gain nor loss, increase nor diminishment, obedience nor disobedience, except as a result of God's decree and predestination and wisdom and will. What he wishes is, what he does not wish is not. Not even the casual glance of the spectator nor the stray thought in the mind come to be outside the sphere of his will. He is the originator. He causes recurrence. He is the effector of what he wills. He causes recurrence is the Arabic term al-mu'id, and effector is fa'al. So this is a kind of a different approach. So on the one hand, he's not completely rejecting determination, that some things are determined, but he's not completely advocating free will either. Typical sort of Sunni approach.
Yeah, so Islam does believe in kind of... does Islam believe in that our life is preordained by God, or to some extent that... the saying you hear everyone say is, well, Allah has a plan for you.
Yeah.
The decisions you make might not make sense now, or the hardships that you go through might not make sense now, but in due time they will. So how much of our life is there, or what's the balance? How much of our life is preordained?
Well, when you say, what
God?
does Islam say? This is a kind of problematic phrasing. You know, it's Muslims, and it's Muslims when and where.
Yeah.
You know, if you went and asked a sort of extreme Ash'ari, he would say that it's all predetermined. If you asked Al-Ghazali, he would give the kind of in-between position and advocating, at least in this context, we're discussing his Sufi notion of tawakkul. If you're asking me, I don't necessarily agree with this completely either. I think that there are certain things which are explicitly stated, and this is the thing. I mean, if you want to talk about within the Islamic intellectual tradition, if you have a text, if you have solid text, so there are certain things, in fact, they're mentioned here, aren't they, which are solid. So, you know, things like your lifespan, that's supposed to be predetermined. Mm-hmm. Your rizq. Now, rizq is a word in Arabic which means sustenance, but it includes a lot of things. It's not just physical wealth or money. It's all kinds of sustenance. These things are predetermined, according to very solid texts. But then on the other hand, there's a lot of things which are not. There's
things like where you go to college, or
there are decisions. There are decisions that a human being makes. So it's something very similar to what Al-Ghazali is saying. But I don't. When I say I don't agree, I don't entirely agree with his whole presentation. Again, he was not a philosopher throughout this. I don't want to get into this now. If you want to know my take, maybe at the end, or maybe we'll make a different video. Throughout this whole discussion, many terms have not been defined. I'm big on defining terms. What is good? You have to define what do we understand by evil, what do we understand by good, etc. So in short, I think that there are certain things which are determined, certain things which are not determined. And that's not that hard to understand. Yeah. You cannot choose who your parents are. And that extends a lot farther than just the idea of parentage. In other words, you cannot determine, you cannot choose your bloodline, your genetic makeup. You're simply born with it. It's the hand that you are dealt, so to speak. And where you were born and which circumstances you start out in, and so on and so forth. Can't be determined. They're fixed. At any rate, I mean, if you want to know my whole take, I've actually done this already. My whole kind of, in brief, my understanding of the so-called problem of evil, although I don't present a full-blown theodicy. I already did a video on that.
On reflections?
Yeah. And I even have a document. But in there, I'm just trying to defend the idea that the existence of evil in the world is not in contradiction with belief in Allah, or belief in God as Muslims and as most monotheists, as most Christians and Jews understand. Anyhow, so where did we leave off there? To continue with this and conclude, where did we leave off? Yeah, so God wills certain things. So there is a certain amount of tension in Al-Ghazali between, as there is in all of these positions, really, between a kind of free will and determinism. So there is something which really distinguishes Al-Ghazali from Western philosophical understanding of theodicy. Al-Ghazali, this is on page 54, makes no effort to present pain, incapacity, illness, or poverty as anything other than the evils they are. So he doesn't have this privation theory, as far as I can see. Nor are such misfortunes the result of social inequity or accident or human wickedness. God intends poverty. This is Ormsby's words here. Or pain or disbelief for certain individuals, just as he intends wealth, well-being, and belief for others. No attempt is undertaken here, by Al-Ghazali in other words, to absolve God from responsibility for these circumstances. This does not mean that Al-Ghazali will not offer a variety of explanations for evil, and particularly the evil of suffering. So stay tuned. But that the question of the ultimate authorship of evil does not arise. This is the key point. The question of the ultimate authorship of evil does not arise, or at least does not occupy the central position in his version of theodicy that it occupies in Western versions. And I think even for most modern Muslims, that would be a central question. Right, so much for divine wisdom in the natural order, divine wisdom in the social order. The other important aspect that's there in the first 40 lines or so is the idea that this world's perfection is to a very great degree hidden. And that's also there in the Qut al-Qulub passages in Abu Talib al-Makki. The idea is that, remember what we said about this whole idea of amazement and wonder, and that sense of amazement and wonder is lost on most people because of familiarity. It's also just due to ignorance. I mean, a lot of people, they don't bother to contemplate, and even if they did, a lot of it is imperceptible, or has to be can only be arrived at through maybe sustained sort of analysis. I remember when I was in 7th grade in biology, we studied the sponge. Yeah, it's a living creature. Now most of the sponges that you use are synthetic, but the sponge is an actual living creature. And I think we spent something like a week on that, and it was very, very complicated. I don't remember all of these things too well. I was never very interested in biology. But what appears to be a very simple organism is actually very, very complex. And that goes all the way down to the cellular level. So these things are not immediately perceptible. They are imperceptible. They are hidden. The hiddenness of the world's perfection. I mean, even a simple unicellular creature like an amoeba or a paramecium is very complex. Or the DNA molecule, or even something completely invisible, like a virus.
Like a virus, I was about to say.
Whether natural or man-made.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very complex. Man-made in the sense genetically modified, right?
Yeah.
Genetically engineered.
We don't need to get into that.
So Abu Talib al-Makki, in the passage, which Al-Ghazali has reworked, avoids any imputation of constraint on God by declaring that the excellence of the world is simply imperceptible to most people. Thus, for him, it is more a question of the limited nature of the human intellect. The presumption that a better world is possible is only a result of that limitation. Yes. So this is what is kind of different between Al-Ghazali and Abu Talib al-Makki. So let's read the translated passage from Abu Talib al-Makki and see how different it is from Al-Ghazali's very audacious statement that let's quote it as he actually said it in translation. And there is not in possibility anything whatever more excellent, more perfect, and more complete than it. Abu Talib al-Makki doesn't go that far. Again, you ought to keep in mind that this is a reworking of a passage from the Qut al-Qulub. So the key part here is quoted over pages 58 and 59. Ormsby translates the passage from Qut al-Qulub, which is in book 3, page 52 of the edition that he used. God lets the world order take its course in conformity with the intellect's own order, and the meanings of the customary and usual course of events, through well-known means and accepted instrumentalities, to the measure of that with which intellects are imprinted by nature, and for which they have an innate propensity. So God conceals the ends and veils mysteries. Then there's an ellipsis, ... Hence the excellence of the world order and the beauty of the divine decree are by their very nature hidden. Most people are ignorant of the underlying principles, except for those who trust in God. So again, this notion of tawakkul is there. So this whole thing is kind of hidden. We can't really see it, but if we rely on God, maybe it sort of becomes revealed to us. Ormsby glosses this at length. He says, the world is aligned with the human mind in such a way that the mind cannot see it except in terms of its habitual perspective. Moreover, God has the world follow this course intentionally, and he conceals its true excellence. Man is not apt to perceive this excellence in the normal pattern of events because the world and the mind are attuned in such a way that he cannot. But if man, through attainment of trust in God, tawakkul, were to see the world as it is, he would recognize its supreme excellence and beauty, and he would know that neither illumined intellects nor mystic knowledge can necessitate anything other than this world order. So he's basically saying that, look, the universe, there is a divine wisdom in the universe. Things are proceeding according to some sort of a divine plan. Most people cannot perceive this divine wisdom and this great sophistication and this beauty, but if they rely on God, they can arrive to some sort of state. Now, this is all just pretty okay. Nothing really audacious here. So he says that this is merely latent in al-Makki's text. What indeed is not an issue at all, the question of God's power, is cast into a rather bold relief in Ghazali's reworking. In the face of this, certain commentators would be tempted to return to al-Ghazali's source and to propose that perhaps nothing more was meant than what al-Makki had originally put forth. In other words, that the human mind is simply incapable of conceiving a better order of things. But it doesn't really work. It doesn't really work. And there's a very perceptive commentator and person involved in this dispute. He's Al-Jazairi, who wrote a text. We have to find his full name because there's actually two Al-Jazairis. Let's to refer to the bibliography. ABCDEFGHIJ. Hamdan Al-Jazairi. So he wrote a book called Hikmatul Arif, in which he looks at this possible interpretation. He says, if it were said that the possibility of a better world stands in relation to those things knowable to people and to their capacities, and that they are not able to imagine anything better and more wonderful than this world, then it would be valid and conceded, but not in relation to God's omnipotence. But Al-Ghazali goes further. In other words, Al-Ghazali really draws out the implications of what are there in the Qut al-Qulub passage, and reworks it and really says in a very sort of audacious way that there really can't be anything more perfect than what is. In other words, he's laying bare, as Ormsby puts it, all the hidden consequences of the Abu Talib al-Makki text, and then very boldly affirms the impossibility of a more excellent or better state of affairs. And there couldn't be anything more controversial than that. Again, because of the long-standing issues there in Islamic theology about the nature of divine omnipotence, the divine will. So it's a very interesting kind of statement. Al-Ghazali is, of course, again making it in the context of tawakkul, but he says it in such a bold way that it led to this centuries of sort of controversy. And he did defend it later. So this idea, which is there at the end of the chapter, that maybe, this isn't Al-Ghazali. Maybe this one sentence, this phrase has been added to the manuscript. Highly unlikely. The Ihya Ulumuddin was well known in his time, in his lifetime. So much so that people made objections to it. The kind of objections that were made were, especially by hadith scholars, that he doesn't know hadith so well and so forth. And he wrote a treatise called, I think it was Kitab al-Imla fi Hal Mushkilat al-Ihya. The dictation concerning the solutions to supposed problems in the Ihya. And he defended this position. So maybe he was a little inconsistent because he said other things in other writings. Maybe he wasn't a very sophisticated kind of philosophical thinker, but he was upholding this idea, albeit originally having introduced it in the context of Sufi praxis and cultivation of certain inner states and so forth. But it's a very audacious statement, and it has all these implications. And in the next lecture, we'll look at the rest of the passage. Like I said, it's about 100 lines, the next 40, 50 lines, whatever. And then we will then look at the chapters after that and how this controversy sort of played out over time. And yes, if you are more interested in just what my own opinion is, you'll have to watch that other video. We'll put the link in the description.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching, and we'll pick this up in about a week, inshallah.